Good afternoon. I'm Bob Eby. I'm the chairman of the Tennessee State Board of Education. It's 1 o'clock Central, 2 o'clock Eastern. I want to welcome everyone to the second meeting of the TISA Review Committee. The stated purpose of our meeting is to regularly evaluate, to monitor the effectiveness of the TISA funding formula, and to make recommendations on improvements. I will ask Mr. Nathan James to please call the roll.
All right, when I call your name, just to shout out if you happen to be here as a designee. I know there's several. Michelle Simcox,
Here.
Representative Mark White. We got Carly.
Carly Bowers here for Chairman Mark White.
Great. David Connor. David Connor, no luck. Right. Jessica Bryant for Senator White.
I'm here.
Ben Torres, I think he's got a designee this time.
Hi, Nolan Combs here for Ben Torres.
Nolan, thanks for joining us. Eddie Pruitt.
Here.
Ron McPherson. Anybody from Knox County Schools? Sarah Morrison.
Here.
Okay, Crystal Nelson.
Here.
Right, for Commissioner Reynolds. It's usually Mary Ann, but I know she is on some well-earned vacation, so. Carolyn, can we take you as a designee?
Yes, that works. That's Karen.
Karen, sorry about that. For Commissioner Bryson, I know Greg Turner is expecting you to be on by 1:15. I don't know if he's made it here yet. I can't see quite everybody. He'll be on. Cliff Lippard.
Yep, I'm here.
Marlon Davis.
Here.
Daryl Cobbins. Pam Jones.
Here.
Comptroller Mumpower.
Allison Pam's here for Comptroller Mumpower.
Kathy Cobb. Kathy's got a designee.
Yes, Carrie Pig here for Kathy Cobb.
Hi, it's nice to see you. All right, Gary Lilly.
Here.
Chris McCart.
Here.
Jessica Himes.
Here.
Troy Kilzer.
Here.
Jeannie Phillips. Is Jeannie on? And Bob Nardo.
Here, Nathan.
Okay, great. Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank each one of you for attending today. We have several presenters and items to discuss, and we do want to spend some time later to talk about potential priorities before our time ends. So first thing we'll do is get into the economically disadvantaged category definitions. We'll get a thorough overview of that issue as we've been charged to do under House Bill 2485. We will be respectful of everyone's time and preserve an hour for that member discussion near the end. So items 3 through 7 on your agenda will be the first half of the meeting, and 8 through 10 will be the last half. With that, I'm going to again recognize Nathan James on our staff to tell us about House Bill 2485 briefly, and then we'll get into our individual presentations.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr. Chairman. This will be rather quick. Let's see, the Senate Bill 2385, House Bill 2485 has become Public Chapter 1032. And in the end, it requires this committee to review how economically disadvantaged students have been identified in this state in each of the past 10 years, including how economically disadvantaged students were identified in the Appropriations Acts for fiscal year 25-26, and how other states identify and fund economically disadvantaged students in public schools. and include in the annual report submitted on or before 1 November of 26 recommendations for how this state may revise the ways in which it identifies economically disadvantaged students to ensure the state is accurately identifying the students in need of additional resources, and recommendations for how this state may better support economically disadvantaged students through TISA. And I want to thank the Senate and House sponsor for working with us on this. There was some discussion at some point in time of creating a whole other committee just to do that. But of course, that's what the TISA Review Committee exists for. So that's the extent of what the law requires. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. James. Our first presenter will be the TDOE overview of the 10-year history of the economically disadvantaged category in Tennessee's funding formula. And I will then call on Karen Burkholder, who's the Director of Data Strategy for TDOE, to make her presentation. Karen, would you like questions held to the end, I presume?
I'm open. I don't mind
Okay.
being interrupted along the way either.
All right, so if a question comes up, a pressing question comes up, raise your hand and we'll try to identify you. Otherwise, hold your questions to the end. Go ahead, Karen.
All right, thank you for having me here today to talk about the economically disadvantaged definition in the state of Tennessee over the last 10 years. I apologize in advance. I'm slightly under the weather, so please excuse me if I need to pause and take a drink of water. So we will look at the current economically disadvantaged definition under TISA. We'll look at ED funding over time, both under TISA and the old BEP funding formula, and then the analysis of Medicaid addition fiscal impact we have done for the state. So first, for all of us to norm, the ED definition has actually remained constant over the last 10 years. It's been constant since the passage of TISA in 2022 and was constant under the BEP since the passage of the BEP Enhancement Act of 2016. The current economically disadvantaged subgroup for assessment, accountability, and TISA funding purposes is defined both in law and Tennessee's Every Student Succeeds Act or ESSA plan as a student identified as experiencing homelessness, foster care, unaccompanied youth, or migrant status, or a student meeting the direct certification eligibility guidelines related to receiving SNAP or TANF supports. At this time, those students classified as either Medicaid free or Medicaid reduced are not included in the ED definition and have never previously been included in the definition. Here is how the current economically disadvantaged funding weight works under TISA. For students who meet the classification of ED, they receive a 25% weight of the base funding amount. So to calculate that, we take the ED or economically disadvantaged average daily membership, we multiply that times the base funding amount and then times the 25% weight. So for fiscal year 2027, that equaled around $1,800 per student. Well, the economically disadvantaged definition has not changed for 10 years. There have been some support provisions put into place in the last several years. These have been put in place because we've had districts experiencing declines in the number of students identified as ED, and to help mitigate the fiscal impact of the decreases in ED student counts, the state has implemented temporary funding protections in the last 3 school years. The first year this was implemented was 24-25. In that year, districts were funded based on the higher of their 22-23 or 23-24 actual economically disadvantaged ADM. In the 25-26 school year, there was a partial coverage of the gap between a district's 24-25 actual ED counts and the 23-24 funded ED ADM. This hold harmless covered 75% of that difference. And then for 26-27 school year funding, there's additional funding generated to cover 100% of the gap between 25-26 actual ED ADM and the 24-25 funded ED ADM. Under BEP, the definition of economically disadvantaged students was the same as it is currently since 2016, but the way students were counted was slightly different. We didn't use average daily membership, but instead a raw count of economically disadvantaged students was taken on based on October 1st enrollment data. Based on that raw count of students, there was a unit cost that was applied to all ED students to get to an ED funding amount for the state. So you can see in fiscal year 2023, which was the final year under BEP funding, that unit cost was about $1,000 per economically disadvantaged students. Here you can see what ED or economically disadvantaged allocations have looked like over the last 4 years. We have also included the actual economically disadvantaged average daily membership of those 4 years, as well as the hold harmless amounts that were calculated. So you can see from fiscal year 23 through fiscal year 26, there's been a pretty consistent decline in the number of students who have met the definition of economically disadvantaged. All right, when the ED bill was floating through legislative session, the Department of Education helped put together fiscal analysis on the cost of including Medicaid students into the economically disadvantaged definition. What you can see here is the analysis. If you look at the second table, this was kind of our assumption set that was used to get to this cost analysis. We used the fiscal year 2027 base funding amount for TISA. Annually, there's been about an average increase of 3.15% in the base funding amount. So that's what we're showing in the second row. We know the ED weighted funding amount is 25%. And based on district submitted data, we expect that adding Medicaid free to the definition of economically disadvantaged would add about 120,000 additional students. I do want to note that this figure is approximate based on current school year data reported by districts. That was rounded due to data fluctuations. I will note this figure could be underreported as districts continue to submit data through the end of the school year. So you can see, based on that assumption set, the total cost to add Medicaid free is assumed to be around $233 million. The weighted funded elements of TISA are a shared responsibility between state and local funding bodies. So that amount would be broken down to about 70% covered by the state, or about 163 million, with 30% covered by locals at about 70 million. And I will pause there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you. Questions?
Mr. Chairman, Matt, this is Bob Nardo. May I ask a question?
Sure, Mr. Bob Nardo, Mr. Nardo.
First of all, Aaron, thank you. Really excellent detailed presentation. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my first question is like an interpretive question. I mean, what do we think has happened to these children, right? 50,000 children have disappeared from ED calculations according to these data over the last, 3 to 4 years. And based on poverty data, it doesn't seem it's because people are less poor.
Yep.
My assumption, and I'm not trying to be catty, I've wondered, because I've seen this effect in my school, in my district. What I have speculated is that the change has been in direct certification eligibility for SNAP and TANF, and that those programs are being scrubbed more, right? And that you either, maybe you've hit your total 5 years of eligibility, so you're still poor. You just have used up your eligibility, so they're not counting you anymore. Or maybe there's paperwork that you're supposed to file to stay in those programs current, and you haven't filed the program, filed it, and so they've scrubbed you off. I mean, these are my hypotheses, but I don't know if that's true. Does the state have any further information on this?
Yeah, so based on state analysis, the lion's share of students qualifying for the economically disadvantaged definition is through SNAP, the SNAP program. And if you look at publicly available SNAP data on the SNAP DHS the Tennessee DHS website, you can see that there's been a decrease in SNAP participants statewide over the same time period. I think some of it has been due to changes in some of the relaxed requirements in the COVID era. But I do think Robin Ye is doing a presentation today too about changes in SNAP and TANF eligibility, and she may be able to get into a little bit more detail. But yeah, the lion's share of the decline has been a decline in statewide participation in SNAP and TANF benefits. So where we haven't changed our definition of economically disadvantaged, if less students are participating in SNAP or TANF, you can see how that would impact even without a change in the definition.
Sure, and without plunging too much into solutions on this right now, I mean, it seems like another question I have is, and if this is more detailed than is appropriate to go into right now, I understand. But I have a pretty good sense of how TISA works in terms of school and district funding determinations and distributions. But what I'm not clear about is, mathematically, the amount of money, right, that goes into TISA for ED should have dropped right? Like all other things held equal, such a large drop, an almost 20% drop in ED over 4 years would mean that that TISA isn't paying out all that money. And so what I'm not clear about is on the back end, formula-wise, are those dollars redistributed into other areas of TISA, or are those dollars that are retained by the state that are then reallocated for other purposes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to bring back this slide because although the actual counts of economically disadvantaged has dropped pretty dramatically because of the hold harmless provisions put in place over the last several years, you can see, for example, for FY25, economically disadvantaged counts were funded at 299,000, which was higher than the actual economically disadvantaged count of FY24. So that hold harmless average daily membership is what we are actually funding at the last couple of years. So we are not seeing the dramatic drop in funding because of the hold harmless provisions that we would have seen without those in place.
Thank you for clarifying. So please forgive me for monopolizing. I'm just trying to ask a couple of quick questions in relationship to each other. So the second column, ED allocations, that is predicated upon the hold harmless amount, correct?
That's correct. And districts were held harmless to their average daily membership, not to their funding level from the previous year. So their funding may have actually increased, as you can imagine, because of the increase in the base funding amount.
Yes. So one thing, and if you don't have it now, that's totally fine, but it might be interesting to see what those numbers would look like based on the actual. Yep. So in other words, the short answer to the first question is the quote unquote savings were all reinvested in the hold harmless, so there weren't savings, which makes sense. Mm-hmm. But it would be interesting to see what the allocations, would have been without the hold harmless so that we can identify actually how much money is at stake. And then under the terms of TISA, can you clarify for me? I mean, are those dollars required to be reinvested elsewhere in the model, such as increases in the base, or are those dollars that are essentially back to the General Assembly to decide how to spend?
So they're not reallocated into the formula for the year, but they do stay in the funding pot to be used like the following year. So it reduces, it can reduce what the ask is for budget for the following year.
Got it. So they're not necessarily redistributed anywhere. If the ED spend is less than the model predicted because of reductions in ED, those monies aren't just taken back for other purposes, but they could be reinvested, whether it's in the hold harmless or in other areas of TISA. Great. And at some point, you guys can maybe show us what the data would be, what the allocated spending would have been without the hold harmless.
Yeah, that's easy math to share. So I'm happy to do that calculation and share it back with this group.
My very last thing is, would you just go back to the slide before this for one more moment?
This one.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me all those questions.
Okay, sure. Other questions for Ms. Burkholder?
I do have a question, if you don't mind.
Sure, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Karen, for providing these slides, and I hope we get an opportunity to take a look at these that they're shared with us, as we did on our prior meeting, where we can kind of dig into the numbers a little bit. They're kind of small on my screen, so some of those I couldn't see. Plus, my age hinders me a little bit. Just a couple questions. Do you know where did the definition for ED originate? And also, does that apply just to the funding formula that we're currently discussing, or does it apply to other aspects of what the state uses to fund different programs?
Yeah, that's a good question, and some of this happened before my time at the department, so I might have to refer us back to Mary Andersky when she's at the next meeting, but I believe the definition was originally set in the BEP Enhancement Act of 2016, and that definition's also set in the ESSA plan. When the definition was set, Medicaid was not part of direct certification in the state of Tennessee. So Medicaid was a pilot program that began later as part of direct certification to directly certify more students for free and reduced price meals. The economically disadvantaged definition was not changed when that pilot program was started to expand and include that group. Where was the definition set? And I feel like you asked a follow-up question beyond that, and now I think I've lost it, if you want to remind me.
Yeah, I think it was, does that apply to other
Oh, yeah.
aspects of state funding pieces, that maybe Department of Children's Service stuff uses? So,
I'm not familiar with Department of Children's Services, so we would have to look into that and get back to you. But this definition is also currently used for assessment and accountability. So if there was a legislative change to this definition, it would depend where that change happened to determine whether the change in definition would only impact TISA funding or if it would also impact other calculations at the state, such as the accountability calculation. If a change in law pointed to a change in the definition of the ESSA plan, it would also impact the accountability system. Which, not to say that it's a positive or negative, just making sure that everyone's aware that it's possible to do it without changing it everywhere it is, or to change it in only certain places.
Okay. Did it require legislative action then to set this back in 2016, this definition?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Other questions?
This is Jessica Himes. I had a quick question, please.
Sure. Go ahead, Ms. Himes.
How long is the hold harmless provision in effect for the ED count?
It's been applied each year through the Appropriations Act, so it's not an ongoing provision. It's only been applied for 1 year at a time.
At a time.
Kind of a band-aid at the moment.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I said kind of a band-aid at the moment.
Yeah, that was going to be my next comment is, are we setting locals up for a fiscal cliff by continuing to fund this hold harmless, and then once it ends, what's the result going to be?
Yeah, I think that's a great question that should be included in recommendations from this committee.
Good comments. Other questions? If none, go ahead, Mr. Burkholder. Finish your.
Sorry, may I ask one? I was waiting until everyone else had a chance. Can I ask one more?
Sure.
This is more speculative and sort of future solution oriented, Karen. So, obviously speak to it whatever level you're comfortable with. But my sense is that when the bill was proposed around expanding the definitions, some of the balking was at like the total size of the fiscal note or what have you. And it's like, okay, fair enough. The current number is too low, but that fix would maybe make it too high, right? Okay, whatever. Well, couldn't we look at something in between where we say, okay, the expansion through the Medicaid would be the simplest way to be more inclusive of actual poor people who are in need of this resource, but we lower the weight percentage, for instance, if expanding the denominator that much multiplied by that weight creates a number that's too expensive, we could still categorically capture more people, but give less money so that the state is still spending about the amount that it wants, but it just follows the people who need it the most. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here, and I have no idea whether that was discussed by the bill sponsors, but I mean, is that the kind of thing that would seem like a way to resolve this or not?
I think that's certainly something the committee could look into, and I think it's something that some other states have done, assign different weights to different economically disadvantaged categories. If I can just put two more quick considerations in front of the group, I think one thing that has been unpopular about this definition with districts is the volatility because of its dependence on outside programs that the Department of Education doesn't have control over, like SNAP and TANF. So just want to call to attention that adding Medicaid, while it will expand the number of students, doesn't necessarily get rid of that volatility. So just something to keep in mind as the group moves forward. And then also adding Medicaid as compared to the current hold harmless for some districts, that might be a growth in the number of students qualifying for economically disadvantaged, but not necessarily for all districts. So just a couple quick points to share with the group.
Do you have any idea if you did it, a straight Medicaid, how many additional people that would be across the state?
So including Medicaid reduced in addition to Medicaid free?
Well, I'd prefer to have them both. So in other words, give me first Medicaid alone and then Medicaid plus Medicaid reduced. If
I
you
have
that.
Medicaid free on the slide at around 120,000. I'll have to pull up what adding Medicaid reduced does. I have that. I just need to open the document, and I can get back to y'all if y'all want to move on, and I can drop it in the chat or something.
Thank you. Very good. Does that complete your presentation?
It does. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next is the Education Commission of the States presents on how the states define economically disadvantaged. Chris Duncombe, are you going to lead that part of the discussion?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and I'll have Andrew, my colleague, kick us off.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Eby and the members of this committee for welcoming us today. My name is Andrew Johnson, and it's my honor to serve as the Tennessee State Liaison for the Education Commission of the States. Before we get started, I'm going to give a brief overview for anyone unfamiliar with us of who we are, what we do, and how we do it. The Education Commission of the States was created through the Interstate Compact for Education as a nonpartisan, non-advocacy catalyst for policymaker collaboration, innovation, and learning. We serve as a partner to all state education leaders, including governors and legislators, along with their staff, state departments of education, and of course, state boards of education. In this partnership, we provide personalized support, information, and peer connection. Our policy team covers the full spectrum of education issues, from early learning through post-secondary and workforce development. ECS was created from a simple idea. Informed policymakers are better positioned to craft impactful policy decisions. To this day, we believe in the power of learning from experience, using our research and knowledge of state approaches and promising practices from across the country to help policymakers make informed decisions. We strive to equip state leaders with the best resources, innovative ideas, and deep peer connections. We provide options, not advocacy. Our only agenda is to help. Now, how do we do that? In short, we conduct research, publish reports, host convenings, and provide counsel to state education policymakers. We research and report on trending education topics. Our policy reports and 50 state comparisons are available for free on our website, ecs.org. If we don't have an immediate resource for your question, you can reach out to me, and our policy team can usually have a written response in about 3 days. Beyond that, we convene state leaders to collaborate and learn from one another. And when invited, we show up and talk with groups just like this to share how other states are approaching an education policy issue and to offer ideas and examples for your consideration. We have a strong bench of policy experts standing by to assist you. If you're looking for a resource or expertise when considering a policy issue, just contact me and our team, your education policy team, will be ready to work for you. Thank you all for welcoming us. And with that, I'll yield the floor to Chris Duncombe and Katja Krieger.
Thank you, Andrew, for Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. My name is Katja Krieger, and I'm a policy analyst at Education Commission of the States, where I track legislation and respond to information requests. I'm also a graduate of Vanderbilt University, where I received my master's in public policy and education policy. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to present to you all today. And I'll pass it to Chris to introduce himself.
Hello, members of the review committee. Excited to be here. My name is Chris Duncombe. I lead our K-12 research on funding issues and our legislative tracking. Today, we're going to be examining how states identify and fund services for students from low-income backgrounds. And when I use the terminology low-income backgrounds, I'm referring to the same economic disadvantage that we just heard in that previous presentation from TDOE. I'm going to start by providing an overview of the issue. Then I'm going to hand it back to Katya, who's going to walk through the national landscapes for how other states are approaching this issue. And then finally, I'll end with some strategies worth considering for Tennessee based upon what we saw in that national landscape. I'm happy to take questions as they come up, or we'll also have time at the end. So first off, to just frame the national discussion, many states provide supplemental state funding for supporting instructional services for students from low-income backgrounds. In our most recent 50-state comparison, we identified 44 states in DC that provide this funding stream. That includes Tennessee. These funds can be used by districts for a variety of purposes, including to provide academic supports for students who are behind in their schoolwork, such as tutoring or mentoring. Can also include teacher recruitment and retention incentives for hard-to-staff schools, or counseling and mental health services for students. One of the reasons that we see so many states providing these resources for schools and students is that targeted investments can yield the largest gains in student outcomes. The academic literature examining the relationship between school spending and student outcomes shows a positive relationship. The findings I'm sharing on this slide are from research from Kirabo Jackson, an economist at Northwestern. And he found a 10% increase in funding that was sustained across 12 years. So an entire K-12 education for a student resulted in a variety of benefits. But relevant to this conversation, students from low-income backgrounds showed the most pronounced benefits from that increased spending. For decades, the measure for identifying students facing economic barriers has been through participation in free or reduced price meals. States have consistently depended on this data to allocate resource and design their accountability systems. However, with the growth of free meal programs, fewer and fewer schools are collecting this data and the measure has become increasingly obsolete. So there's been a transition away. I put up the free and reduced price lunch percentages based on the federal poverty level on the slide just for your context. This transition has been caused by increased participation in the Community Eligibility Program, which is a federal program in the 2010 Healthy, Hungry, Free Kids Act that allows eligible schools and districts to receive federal reimbursement to offer all students free meals. So this expands student access to free meals, but it does impact the collecting of free or reduced price meal forms. And these schools aren't collecting these forms. State initiatives has also impacted the collection of free or reduced price meal data. There's now 9 states that offer universal free meals. I've included those states here on the slide. So the expansion of free meals has many benefits for students, but is also forced states to explore alternative measures for family income. And I'll hand it off to Katya, who will provide an overview of those different approaches.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for that context. I'll now be providing an overview of different state approaches for identifying students from low-income backgrounds. So the primary approaches that we're seeing states use are direct certification in federal benefit programs, which was mentioned earlier, using census data, using income tax records, and finally using supplemental family income surveys. So the most common approach for states is to use participation in federal benefit programs, which is called direct certification. Under this method, a child in a household that participates in SNAP and in some states TANF, the food distribution program on Indian reservations, or Medicaid are automatically enrolled. States can decide which programs they use for direct certification, but they are required by federal law to include SNAP. Direct certification is also already used by states to determine school and district eligibility for the federal community eligibility provision that Chris mentioned. In addition, children can be categorically eligible and enrolled based on whether the student is experiencing homelessness, in foster care, an immigrant, or in a Head Start program. We identified at least 20 states, including Tennessee, which use direct certification for identifying low-income students. Some states that include Medicaid data in direct certification are Colorado, Massachusetts, Indiana, Illinois, Louisiana, and South Carolina. So when looking at some of the advantages and potential challenges with using direct certification, advantages include administrative ease. So states are already providing direct certification data to the federal government for the community eligibility provision. And because it's already being collected, families don't need to submit an additional application. There's also similar income thresholds to other programs. For instance, free lunch eligibility and Tennessee's SNAP eligibility are both 130% of the federal poverty level, and Medicaid is at least 133% of the federal poverty level. When it comes to challenges, there are different income thresholds to reduce lunch, which is 185% of the federal poverty level. There's also eligibility variation. States may select different programs for their different certification counts, and so they may have different income thresholds. For instance, TANF maximum monthly earnings that a family of 3 can have range from $268 in Alabama to $2,359 in Minnesota. And finally, there's, underreporting of certain groups. So low-income families may not be enrolled because of lack of eligibility, fear of stigma associated with being on public benefits, distrust of the government, and a lack of knowledge about their eligibility. So as far as a state example, Massachusetts uses both direct certification and family income forms. Their current methodology for direct certification defines students as economically disadvantaged based on their participation in SNAP, their Transitional Assistance for Families and Dependent Children program, the state's foster care program, and their Medicaid program. And then in addition to that, Massachusetts has the Student Opportunity Act, which allows districts to use an optional supplemental low-income data collection form to try and identify students who are missed in the direct certification process. And this form helps identify students who are living in families with incomes up to 185% of the federal poverty level, which is the same eligibility as free and reduced price lunch.
Just to clarify, I think it's the case, go back to that slide. If they hit any one of those first 4 categories, then they're determined economically disadvantaged. They don't have to be in multiple categories, correct?
Yes, if they hit any of the categories, so not all of the categories. Yeah. So yeah, an alternative method is to use census block group data or child poverty rate data. The American Community Survey is a demographic survey from the US Census Bureau that's sent to approximately 3.5 million households annually, and it covers over 40 topics ranging from housing, employment, to US citizenship status. And the ACS measures the percentage of children under 18 living in low-income families in each district. Another example using US Census data is through the Small Area Income and Poverty Estimate Program, or SAPE. SAPE combines the American Community Survey estimates with the Internal Revenue Service, state level data, and state and county SNAP benefits data. SAPE also informs the allocation of federal Title I aid allocations. The US Census Bureau annually publishes the SAPE data in December of each year with the childhood poverty rates for children ages 5 to 17 for each school district in the country. Pennsylvania and Oregon are 2 states that use SAPE data. Montana, New Mexico, North Carolina use Title I aid to drive allocations. So when looking at the trade-offs for census data, there is administrative ease. It's produced by the U.S. Census Bureau, so it's not, as much of a burden on state or local officials. There's also eligibility that's constant across states. So I mentioned earlier, there's differences that exist in direct certification counts, but these counts are based solely on the percentage of students living in poverty. ACS provides multiple indicators that states can use to measure socioeconomic status, including parental educational attainment, employment status, housing stability, and linguistic isolation, and other indicators. When thinking about the challenges, this is not specific to public schools. So estimates are of the entire population, not just students enrolled in public schools. And states with higher percentages of children in private school or states looking to expand private school options may not want to use this as a data source. There's also ACS data provides neighborhood level poverty rather than specific student household data. Researchers from the Urban Institute have found that geographic measures of poverty can be less accurate than free and reduced price lunch data because students can attend schools outside of their home district. And then finally, there's some lag time. So the US Census publishes data 1 full year behind. So currently the most recent US Census data is from 2024. So an example of a state that uses census block group data is Texas. Texas enacted HB 3 in 2019, which adopted a tiered approach to compensatory funding based on the census block group of students. And using ACS data, the census block tiers consider median household income, the average educational attainment of the population, the percentage of single parent households, the rate of home ownership, and then other economic criteria that the commissioner determines. And as I mentioned previously, because data is at the census block level, it is about all children in that area and not necessarily about students specifically in public schools. Rather than relying on proxy measures for income, states can also go directly to state income tax returns to determine eligibility based on family income. This requires cooperation between multiple state departments, so the Department of Taxation, Departments of Education, and Department of Human Services. Currently, New Mexico is the only state using income tax data directly. Now, thinking through some of the advantages and challenges with this approach, for the advantages, the state's not reliant on participation in federal programs where the federal government determines eligibility. So in this way, the state can set the income thresholds at the desired income levels. For challenges, there's some administrative burden. This requires cooperation across multiple departments and may require additional state resources in order to coordinate and facilitate. And finally, with data privacy, so the Department of Revenue may not be able to share individual income tax returns with the Department of Education, so there may be some additional hurdles there. So when looking at New Mexico is the first state in the country to use state income tax records to allocate need-based funding. The state launched the initiative in 2021 when they adopted the Family Income Index to provide targeted intervention services. And in 2025, they enacted legislation to use the index to allocate the at-risk aid in their K-12 funding formula. The state developed the index with collaboration across 3 state agencies, the State Departments of Education, the State Department of Taxation, and then the Department of Human Services. The Family Income Index identifies students based on the 5 different family income levels, ranging from 75% to 225% of the federal poverty level. The last option would be for the state to develop a supplemental family income form that school districts can administer. These forms would gather information on household size and income directly from families. States with supplemental forms include Washington, Vermont, and as discussed previously, Massachusetts. In Vermont, the State Agency of Education has a Fill the Form campaign where the state provides technical assistance to districts to help get families to complete some of these forms. When it comes to the trade-offs, advantages and challenges, states can use family income forms as a supplemental measure to identify students that were not identified through other means. So, for instance, if students eligible for SNAP or TANF who live in a family that are not enrolled in one of these programs, they may be identified through the family income form. As far as challenges, it can be an additional form for families to complete and school districts to collect, and it may cost the state. There's also no financial incentives for completion. So with free and reduced meal forms, families completed the forms, received some incentives, versus with this approach, there's no additional benefit, which could reduce participation. All right, and now I will pass it back to Chris to summarize some of the trade-offs I discussed and to talk about some different state strategies.
Great, thank you, Katya, and I want to be cognizant of your time, so I'll try to be brief here. So I wanted to have a slide here that just highlighted some of these trade-offs, because as Katya pointed out, there are advantages and challenges to each of the different approaches. So I wanted to kind of capture at a high level what those are. So for direct certification, this is kind of the default route, easy to administer, but some students that were previously counted on free reduced price lunch will likely not be included in these counts. Ways that states have gone to combat that has been trying to include as many federal benefit programs as possible in their direct certification count, such as Medicaid or categorical eligibility. For census data, both SAPE and ACS are good approaches for states with low percentages of students in private schools, and for states that aren't looking to expand their school choice programs. Tennessee has recently expanded the eligibility for their ESA program, so there may be some trade-offs with going with this approach. For income tax records, I'll be brief on this one. States need to have a state income tax. That's a challenge for Tennessee since Tennessee does not have a state income tax. But we did want to just highlight this approach as was one of the approaches that are out there and are used by states. And then finally, for family income forms, these forms may have low response rates, but they can be useful as an additional supplemental measure to one of the other approaches. So I'll leave you with some strategies that we've been seeing in states. The first is that you can consider using multiple approaches, as these methods are not mutually exclusive and can be used together. Katya highlighted Massachusetts. They're a good example where they have direct certification that includes Medicaid, and they have a supplemental income survey to capture students that aren't found identified by the direct certification count. Similarly, in New Mexico, for families that aren't reporting state income, uses census data and direct certification as well. And then the other strategy being to pilot new approaches. So if Tennessee is considering going away from the direct certification approach and to take on a new method, it can be helpful to pilot a new approach in a few districts before going to statewide, because of the stability issues that were mentioned earlier in the presentation. This is a large amount of money going to districts that have big impacts on the services that schools can provide. So it's helpful to make sure that there are no unintended consequences from transitioning to a new approach. Texas, when they transitioned to the census blocks, they had two of their independent school districts, Houston and San Antonio, take on this approach prior to the state adopting it statewide. Those two ISDs actually, it was a locally led initiative that was very successful, and then the state decided to adopt statewide. So with that, I will end our overview for how states are identifying students from low-income backgrounds, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Are there questions for ECS?
Mr. Chairman, I
Yes.
just wanted to offer a remark or two before we got into questions too much. First of all, I think it's important for everyone that's on this meeting to understand the critical importance that the Education Commission of the States has played over time in terms of education policy. It was formed back when the creation of the Federal Department of Education came around. The states themselves were concerned that this is a primary constitutional responsibility of the states, and they were worried about being kind of put on the back burner. It's done through an interstate compact, and so you've got an act of Congress, and then each of the legislatures that signs up. I will tell you, over the course of my career, dating back to my time in this working for the Senate Education Committee in 08, up through working for a governor, and here, nobody's more reliable. You could call them in a pinch, and their folks always come through. So I want to say that on the record that they've been great to work with. And I know it's easy to sit through and say, well, we don't have an income tax and we don't have this, we don't have that. But when ECS brings you something, you know it's the overview that's needed. And that's what the law calls for in this case. So I wanted to say a big thank you, and then I'll hush. Everybody can ask all the questions they want.
Thank you, Mr. James. Good comments. Questions? Let me ask a question. Has anybody ever done a study to look at these different options that are being presented and what the impact of each one of those options or a combination of those options are from the base case? In other words, are we talking plus 5% by bringing in all these options? Are we talking plus 30%? Or are we talking just very few?
So thank you, Chair, for that inquiry. There's a few national organizations that kind of summarize these approaches in a written form that I can provide. Urban Institute comes to mind. I don't know if there's like a lot of modeling done on the financial impact for each of the different approaches in the states. But I do think they have estimates for increases of number of students that are identified, which might be informative in modeling estimates here in Tennessee.
Yeah, that's what I was most interested in. Is it a 20% increase in the number of students for options A, B, and C versus option A alone, et cetera? If that modeling existed or not, just a question.
Thanks, Chair. I have seen posted by Food Research Action Council, and I can pull this resource, that for when the states that initially brought in Medicaid into their direct certification count, they saw a 10%, around a 10% increase. And I can pull and share that resource and follow up to this conversation.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Hey, this is Bob Nardo again. First of all, absolutely superb presentation, incredibly helpful details. Thank you so much for sharing that and for the work went into it. Just a brief comment and then a question. As someone who, there may be others on this call who also in the old days hand evaluated many free and reduced price meal applications. I've personally done thousands in the old days, and in many ways I was glad to put that behind me. However, as a matter of fact, we actually, even though we have direct cert now for K-12, those of us who operate early childhood programs in Shelby County know we have a large locally funded pre-K program in Shelby County, and we have to do individual level income determinations for that program because they use a slightly different eligibility scale. So actually, there are still thousands of individual determinations based on applications being done in our state today for publicly related educational programs. So I just wanted to share that it's not quite as crazy as it sounds to bring that back as a supplementary method of determining eligibility. And I like your point that allows you, whether you use the federal designations or choose a state level, cutoff, that would give you some flexibility. I'm wondering if there's any further details you can share about those states that you mentioned. I know you said Massachusetts is using it as a supplement. Maybe there's some others. Are there any other lessons on, how they're doing it better than we used to when bringing that back or not?
Thank you for that question. I think that Katya shared a little bit about Vermont's effort, and they're trying to do a statewide campaign where they're actually providing state technical assistance to districts and promotional materials to reach out to families to to make them knowledgeable about these forms and assist them in getting families to fill them out and complete them. And I think that is an important role the state can play when there's not the obvious benefit of getting a meal as a result of filling out and filing those forms. And Kaji, is there any additional information that I'm missing?
Yeah, Massachusetts is also an example that I mentioned, and I think they have a really comprehensive campaign that supports schools in administering the form, but then also allows multiple different options for families to demonstrate income, not only from having an income tax, but they also allow in some students a community member to testify on the family's income. And so and they also offer the forms in multiple different languages. And so I think Massachusetts and Vermont are two states that do a really great job in making sure that the forms are easy to administer and accessible to families.
Okay, any final questions for ECS? Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
My only brief follow about that, and again, this is more speculative and future facing. I mean, yes, I see your point that if you're not going to get it to benefit sort of the system, and that feels diffuse. And in the case of our pre-K program in Memphis, it's to establish your eligibility for the program. So there's another high stakes incentive to do it that you wouldn't have for something diffuse like this. But at risk of sounding, unreasonable or harsh, I mean, the reality is this does affect the resources that are available for people's children. I mean, these are used to determine a lot of resources for schools. I wonder if there is some kind of personal stake, eligibility for tutoring, or for instance, something that could, you got to take the retest of the TCAP, right? Well, maybe you've got to fill out your form. I mean, is that a requirement that we could actually have? Just a thought.
So this is Carrie Peg here, designee for Kathy Cobb. And I do have a question because in the special education world, we use that platform 10 Pulse. And a lot of operational parameters are used when coordinating TennCare Medicaid-related information for outside therapies and behavioral supports. Is that kind of information utilized in this type of thing when we're talking about TISA review? I know Medicaid is under review with the larger scope, and I'm new to this committee, so just trying to understand how all of this information plays into one platform. Is that a resource that the state has used?
Burgholder, would you respond to that, or?
Yeah, so I can take this question. I think the direct certification program is kind of what you're referencing, where we share data across several state agencies for SNAP participation, Medicaid participation, et cetera, to be able to match to student information at school districts and automatically qualify students for free and reduced price lunches. And then it's a subset of those students that are currently qualifying for our economically disadvantaged definition. Let me know if I misunderstood your question, but.
No, that answers it. Thank you.
Yep.
Any final questions for ECS? Well, again, thank you for your presentation. And as Nathan says, thank you for all that you do for the country and for our students. It is very much appreciated. Next is Sycamore Institute presents changes to public benefits, SNAP and TennCare. Ms. Robin Ye.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Can everyone see my screen? What's up?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Good to see everybody on the call. Thanks for having me. My name is Robin Ye. I'm policy director at the Sycamore Institute, and I am going to zoom out a bit and talk a bit about SNAP and TennCare more broadly and the Tennessee's participation over the past couple years or few years, and then also the recent federal changes with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. First, a little bit about Sycamore Institute. If you're not familiar with our work, we are an impartial, nonprofit, nonpartisan data and research center in Tennessee. So we focus on statewide research in a variety of different policy areas across the state. Our ultimate goal is to make information and complex ideas and data accessible to every Tennessean so that they can use that information for their communities and for their advocacy. So Sycamore is not, we do not lobby, we do not advocate for specific issues. We are really just trying to make sure that people have the information they need to go forth with their policy ideas. Like I mentioned, we work across a lot of different research areas. So we have a lot of our work focuses on the state budget. We release a budget analysis every year. We also have a budget primer that goes more into detail about how the state finances work. But we also have a lot of research on health, criminal justice, economic mobility, education, and other topic areas that come up that might be relevant to the state or that are topics of conversation. Like I mentioned, our approach is to be impartial, accurate, and accessible. We are really just trying to be helpful partners to everyone across the political spectrum and across different topic areas. And so we try to remain impartial in our work and just present the facts and the data as is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about first the SNAP program. I know that Karen gave an overview of its tie with the economically disadvantaged definition in TISA, but I'm going to talk about the program broadly and also our participation over the past decade or so. A quick overview of SNAP, nothing that I don't think this group is not familiar with, but SNAP is a joint federal state program that helps low-income households afford nutrition food and maintain food security. The program's eligibility requirements are set by the federal government, and it's administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the Tennessee Department of Human Services is a state agency that is responsible for the actual enrollment of individuals, verifying eligibility, and issuing benefits. I'm not going to go too far in the weeds in terms of what SNAP eligibility looks like, but I did want to highlight the income thresholds with SNAP, since I know that that is something this committee has been thinking about. But so SNAP has multiple different ways in which you are eligible or multiple criteria you have to meet to become eligible for SNAP. There are 2 income thresholds. Individuals who want to receive SNAP benefits have to meet a gross income threshold, which is 130% of the federal poverty level, and a net income threshold, which is 100% of the federal poverty level. And there's also a asset limit as well, which I believe is around $3,000 too, that the individual would have to meet in order to be eligible for SNAP. They also have to meet work requirements as well. So there's actually 2 sets of work requirements with the SNAP program. There are general work requirements, and there are work requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents. So this fun acronym ABAWD. And so there's separate work requirements depending on your age range, depending on kind of if you have a disability or things along those lines. There's certain work requirements that you might have to meet or might not have to meet. And that goes into those recent federal changes that I know a lot of you all have been hearing about over the past year or so, and that we're seeing more of the impact on currently. So the One Big Beautiful Bill made several changes to SNAP, and I'm going to go over them pretty at a high level, but happy to answer any questions. The main change that I think is most likely to affect enrollment in the SNAP program is this change to work requirements. So as I mentioned, SNAP has 2 sets of work requirements, and the One Big Beautiful Bill changed requirements related to the able-bodied adults without dependents set of individuals that are receiving SNAP benefits. What it did is that it expanded the age range of individuals that would have to now meet those work requirements. So previously, that age range was adults between 18 to 54 without a dependent children under 18 years old. And now the age range is 18 to 64 without a dependent children under 14 years old. So that is expected to mean that more people will have to meet work requirements that they didn't have to meet before. And also changed some eligibility and removed eligibility for lawfully present refugees and asylum seekers as well. And there were also there were also changes in the program related to a cost share. And I'm not going to go too far in the weeds on this because this is not necessarily expected to impact enrollment, but it does kind of impact what the state budget will look like going forward. So SNAP had increased the state share for the administrative costs for the program from 50% to 75% starting in fiscal year 2027. And then it also increased the amount that states will have to contribute towards benefits costs. So previously that was entirely funded by the federal government, which are the benefits costs, which is the actual money that goes to SNAP recipients. And now the states will have to contribute a portion of that cost depending on their payment error rate. So states that have a payment error rate of more than 6% are going to have to contribute a portion of state money towards SNAP benefits. Lastly, another update to the SNAP program was changes to the Thrifty Food Plan. So essentially, the Thrifty Food Plan is what determines the amount of funds that is needed, that it's kind of determined for a basket of food that the SNAP program allows individuals to purchase. And so overall, it changed updates to that Thrifty Food Plan to be cost neutral, which means that it doesn't allow for adjustments based off dietary guidelines or changes in food consumption patterns, but it will still be adjusted based off inflation every year. I want to talk a little bit more about kind of what this looks like in Tennessee. So as I mentioned, these work requirements are, I think, going to be the biggest thing that impacts enrollment in the program. A national organization had estimated that 52,000 recipients may need to meet work requirements in order to keep their benefits. It's not clear whether this 52,000 number also includes children living in households that receive SNAP benefits, but just as an estimate in terms of how many people might be impacted by these changes. And of course, there are also impacts to cost, like I mentioned as well, now that the state will have to contribute more state funds towards the SNAP program. In the fiscal year 2027 state budget that was passed by the Tennessee General Assembly, there was $60 million included in the budget to cover that administrative cost share, although the full ongoing cost is expected to be around $77 million. And there's also going to be a benefits cost share too that will kick in fiscal year 2028, and that will really just kind of depend on the state's payment error rate and what that ends up being. But you can see that range can be anywhere between $81 million or $243 million, depending on that payment error rate. Looking at a bit about SNAP participation over the past decade. So SNAP participation, I think it's important to note that this has gone down over the past decade. There's been a decrease. You can see that currently, or as of 2025, based off US Census data and data from the Department of Agriculture, that 9.6% of the state's population are participating in the SNAP program, and that is below the national rate of 12.5%. SNAP participation has also declined in recent months as well. This shows SNAP participation by month as provided by the Department of Human Services. And you can see here that over the past few months, SNAP participation has gone down. So currently, or as of April of 2026, there's been a little less than 600,000 people participating in the SNAP program. And this is a much lower participation rate than I think the state has typically seen at similar times of the years in the past. The One Big Beautiful Bill was passed in July of 2025. And so those SNAP work requirements that I had mentioned earlier and those changes, they technically took effect when the bill was signed into law, though I think we're seeing more of that impact in recent months now that there's more verification and more eligibility verification that is occurring. Moving on to Medicaid, also known as TennCare in Tennessee. So the One Big Beautiful Bill had also made several changes to Medicaid, which in Tennessee is TennCare. So I'm going to go over those pretty quickly as well. So a quick overview of TennCare. It's a federal program that is aimed to provide health insurance for certain populations. Every state has its own Medicaid program according to federal rules, and in Tennessee, that is TennCare. I think it's important to note that TennCare is incredibly complicated, and so I won't try to bore you all with the details of this. But I think that it's important to know that in Tennessee, TennCare, it's based off categorical eligibility. So people are eligible based off whether they are a child, pregnant, with a disability, and every category has its own income or asset limits. And so it very much depends on that person's situation in terms of what income requirements they need to meet in order to be eligible for TennCare. In Tennessee, Children age 6 through 19 are eligible for TennCare if their family's income is less than 133% of the federal poverty line. And the TennCare also has a program called Cover Kids that captures that same age range of children, and children are eligible for that if their income is less than 250% of the federal poverty line. So it captures more kids beyond that just 133% threshold. States also have an option to implement an optional expansion for Medicaid. So this is through the Affordable Care Act. And so they can expand Medicaid to individuals 138% of the federal poverty line. And so I think it's important to note that Tennessee is not an expansion state. So we did not take this option when it happened under the Affordable Care Act. And that I think really plays into the federal changes with TennCare and how that might impact Tennessee. So in terms of the changes to Medicaid or TennCare, so the One Big Beautiful Bill had made several changes to it, and a lot of these changes primarily impacted expansion states. So going through, I guess, this list pretty briefly, a lot of the changes were related to provider taxes and provider payments. So things more so related to the financing side of Medicaid. But a lot of the changes that I think people have been talking about that impact enrollment are mostly applying to expansion states. There were changes to additions of work requirements for individuals on TennCare, things related to more frequent redeterminations, and that primarily impacts those expansion states in which Tennessee is not. So we're not expected to see, major, I think, shifts in the program because of that. Now looking a little bit more deeply at the money related to this. So you all might have seen when the One Big Beautiful Bill was being passed that there was a lot of headlines about it cutting almost $1 trillion in Medicaid, which was major news. But I think it's also important to mention, like I mentioned earlier, that a lot of this was affecting expansion states. So 58% of that reduction are policies that only affect expansion states, in which Tennessee is not. And then 42% of that reduction is spread across all other states. And so a lot of these changes and a lot of these reductions in funding are relative to a baseline projection, which in other words is a future growth, or projected future growth in Medicaid. And so that reduction in federal funds across all states is relative to a baseline that already assumes growth in the program, which means that overall, the effects in Tennessee are expected to be fairly minimal, and they mostly target that provider payments and taxes portion of the program. I also wanted to share a little bit of data from the U.S. Census. This data is from the American Community Survey on the percentage of school-age children in Tennessee that receive Medicaid or means-tested insurance. So I pulled the number and percentage of children age 6 through 18, which was how the age breakdown worked in the American Community Survey. And so as you can see, participation in Medicaid for this group of children has remained relatively flat over the last few years. It's roughly 444,000 children are participating in Medicaid, which is approximately 38% of school-age children in Tennessee. And I also wanted to share some other resources that we have as well before I take any questions. So we have a lot of resources on our website related to federal safety net programs and federal funding. So I would highly encourage you all to check it out if you're looking for more data and information about these programs and about Tennessee's participation in it. And lastly, we also have an email listserv. So this is a QR code that goes to our email list and my contact information. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ye. Questions for Robin?
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask one, was just for perhaps a discussion, or maybe we know of the kids that are listed there in the 444,000 that's been flat these last several years. Are there reliable numbers now that would tell us how many of those schools or whatever are covered by the current definition? that we use? Or is that just something it's not quite known to us, but just figured I'd ask.
I may be able to answer that question for you.
Okay.
So districts currently code students attending public schools both for economically disadvantaged codes that meet the current definition, and they also have a code for Medicaid free or Medicaid reduced eligibility. So we do collect that data from districts. I will say that Medicaid free and Medicaid reduced data is not being used for much right now, and we do see increases in coding of children once there are dollar figures attached to things. So that's where the numbers we're putting out, we are saying our estimates, and we would probably expect them to increase their attention to detail on that data if we included it in the definition. But our estimate for Medicaid free is 120,000 additional students, and Medicaid reduced is 37,500 additional students, not currently covered by the definition.
I also should have mentioned that last slide that I showed on school-age children participating in Medicaid, because that came from the American Community Survey. It's not just public school students, so it captures all children in Tennessee.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Hey, could I ask a question, Robin? Again, absolutely superb. Yet another really fascinating presentation. You mentioned that the sort of like eligibility re-up, in effect, was more a factor in states that had done Medicaid expansion, which Tennessee did not. I'm wondering, but you also said that we have something like a 3% lower rate of participation than the national average, and Tennessee is not substantially wealthier than the nation. And so clearly there's still some kind of gap, right, in where we probably could be and the folks who are on the system. We were talking in the prior presentation about how, we have seen reductions in folks in participation in other programs. So do we know for a fact that kind of eligibility re-up has not been a factor here? I mean, has the state not themselves done some of that irrespective of changing federal requirements, or do you really think that has been stable here even throughout that decline we've seen in eligibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. You might be confusing the SNAP and TennCare enrollment numbers that I shared. So our SNAP enrollment is below. Oh no, you're good. Our SNAP enrollment is below the national average. I don't have off the top of my head whether our Medicaid enrollment is below or above the national average, but the most recent data that I could pull related to that enrollment was from the 2024 American Community Survey. And so I think we don't yet know exactly if even though those changes in redetermination and work requirements with Medicaid will primarily affect enrollment in those expansion states, I don't think that we know yet whether those will have trickle effects in Tennessee until probably a couple years.
Well, maybe this next section will help add some numbers to the undercount too. So if there's no more questions for Ms. Ye, then let's go to Ed Trust. Tennessee presents the undercount report. Jenny Mills McFerrin.
All right. Let me share my screen here. Can everyone see that okay? Okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Jenny Mills McFerrin, and I serve as the Director of Policy and Research at Trust Tennessee. I'm excited to share with you today about our recent report, The Undercount. First, a little bit about Trust Tennessee. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit education research and advocacy organization, and we've been focused on state policy in Tennessee since 2020. And since 2021, we've convened a policy alliance, now almost 100 members strong, to advocate around a shared set of policies to strengthen education in Tennessee from early childhood through post-secondary to ensure all students can thrive. And one of the first issues we took on as an alliance was fair funding for public schools, and our alliance members actively engaged in the process to design and pass TISA. We believe so deeply in the importance of fair funding that we even have a regional initiative called Southerners for Fair School Funding that supports advocates in 10 states across the South. When it comes to school funding, we have a set of principles that guide our advocacy work. These started with our work with TISA, and they continue to inform our work today. We want our funding systems to be adequate, covering the cost of a rigorous and high quality education for all students. We believe it's critically important that funding systems allocate additional funding to students with unique barriers to learning, like students with disabilities and students from low-income backgrounds. We think funding systems are fair when they account for community differences, providing more support to rural and high poverty districts that face higher costs and fewer resources. We think funding systems should be transparent and easy to understand if funds are being well spent. And finally, we believe public funds should fund public schools exclusively. I'm honored to share findings from our report, The Undercount, with you today. And as I share, I want to especially recognize the work of our Higher Education Policy Fellow, Emily Benyak, who authored this report. So if you've heard from the other presentations, Tennessee's economically disadvantaged student definition was determined many years before TISA, and our state uses primarily direct certification to identify students based on participation in SNAP and TANF. One way to think about this is that Tennessee has been using this definition in the state's federal school accountability system for a long time, and it had greater impact once TISA was passed. And so while the definition itself did not change, the way that the definition is associated with fiscal implications really changed when TISA was implemented. A key finding in our report, The Undercount, is that Tennessee's economically disadvantaged student definition is uncommonly narrow compared with other states. As you've heard in other presentations, some direct certification states use Medicaid data in addition to SNAP, and these additional sources are capturing more students. So this graphic shows the difference between the number of students identified in Tennessee compared with the number identified in states with relatively similar numbers of students, median annual incomes, and proportions of students in poverty. And these comparison states use Medicaid to identify students in addition to SNAP. So for example, Indiana identifies 52% of their students as economically disadvantaged compared to 28% in Tennessee. One of the things that's also come up in the other presentations, but that I want to underscore, is that the way this can look district to district can vary quite a bit depending on the definition used. And so for this comparison, we have two school districts that are neighbors and they have relatively similar school enrollment. So you can see that Franklin County Schools has more economically disadvantaged students, that's the dark teal bar at the bottom, than neighboring Coffee County Schools. But if we layer on the students who are identified for free lunch based on Medicaid, Coffee County would have more students identified. We've looked at these data for districts across the state, and we do see considerable variance district to district. And so that's something for the committee to keep in mind, that different definitions may have differential impacts district to district, and that districts may benefit differently from a change in definition. I also want to underscore the volatility, which has also been something that other presentations have hit on. So as you've heard, our economically disadvantaged student counts in Tennessee have been lower than expected, and we're administering hold harmless funding to stabilize that funding weight. And the hold harmless funding has been really critical for districts, but from our perspective, it's not ideal because first of all, it's based on historical enrollment. So it's not measuring the current students who are enrolled in school. It's also not required, which has been talked about before. So it's in place for next school year, but there's no guarantee that that funding will continue. Something I also want to mention that we don't know much about yet is that Tennessee earlier this month expanded broad-based categorical eligibility, which will change who's eligible for SNAP. It will be important for policymakers to understand the timeline for implementation of this change and potential school funding impacts. At the same time that eligibility for SNAP is expanding through BBCE, there are also federal changes, as Robin shared, that will limit SNAP access starting in 2027. So overall, I would just say Tennessee has experienced volatility in the economically disadvantaged student counts and has been implementing hold harmless funding to address that change. And there are a combination of state and federal changes ahead that are likely to continue to cause volatility in the current student definition. And this brings me to some policy considerations to bring before the committee. As you consider your recommendations, one thing EdTrust Tennessee would urge you to think about is stabilizing funding. Thinking about the volatility, the committee may want to consider how much volatility from year to year is desirable, and if there is a role for state agencies to play in smoothing that volatility in the student counts. A really critical question to ask is what comprehensive and adequate identification would look like. EdTrust Tennessee believes the committee should consider additional sources of data to identify students beyond just SNAP and TANF, but different data sources come with different trade-offs. And so, for example, as you've heard from some examples here in the presentation, some data sources are updated monthly while others are updated annually. Other data sources may be updated relatively quickly within a few months, while others could take years to be updated. So data timeliness may be a factor for the committee to consider. And right now, Tennessee uses only student level indicators to identify students. And so something for the committee to consider is if that should continue to be the case, or if community indicators should also be considered, and what the right mix between those indicators might be. And finally, EdTrust Tennessee believes measures beyond public benefits participation should be incorporated because we want to make sure all students experiencing economic hardship are reflected. At the same time, we know something the members of the committee are likely thinking about is the balance between detailed data and the burdens and costs of data collection for students, families, schools, and state agencies. And so with that in mind, we would offer two recommendations for the committee to consider. First, we would urge the review committee to put forward a recommendation for how to stabilize the economically disadvantaged student counts once the current hold harmless funding concludes with the 2027-28 school year. We believe fair and stable funding matters for students, and continued declines in the number of students same time. Oh,
I think we lost you for a second.
oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, so we believe that fair and stable funding matters for students, and continued declines in the number of students identified will impair the ability of TISA to ensure funding is based on true student needs. And at the same time, the presentations today have underscored the complexity involved with a definition change, especially a change to a definition that's been in place for so long. And so, recognizing that complexity, we would urge the committee to set a recommended timeline for when Tennessee should complete the modeling and analysis needed to determine an optimal student definition. And one example of a possible timeline would be the start of the 2030-2031 school year. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. If you'd like to read the full report, you can access it using this link and QR code, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Questions for Ms. McFerrin? Well, if no questions, this concludes the presentations that we've been having with regard to the definition of economically disadvantaged. And the next section is dedicated to discuss the priorities, of which this one I'm sure this committee will consider. What we'd like to do is just kind of use this period to talk about interests that people have and what they see, or things that the committee might recommend, as we then would list for the next meeting. And Nathan, you can correct me if I'm wrong. We would come up with a list and we would have the committee vote on it subsequently. But besides, if any other comments about economically disadvantaged, or any comments about any other priorities people may have. And while you're thinking about that, I did want to raise I got a letter from Aaliyah Guthrie of SCORE, and they had 3 issues that they wanted to make this committee aware of, and I will read these 3 points, and while you're thinking about the other ones. First and foremost, very familiar, refine how TISA supports students experiencing economic hardship. While TISA's commitment to addressing student need is one of the strongest features, the formula's definition of economic disadvantage does not capture the full extent of the student poverty in the state, particularly for districts with higher concentrations of low-income students. We encourage the TISA Review Committee to spend considerable time examining the definitions for economic hardship and concentrated poverty to help ensure resources are reaching the students who need them most. That was point number 1 from SCORE. Number 2, looking at different subjects, strengthen the outcomes funding as a coherent and effective incentive for student improvement. 2 structural challenges limit the effectiveness of outcomes funding. First, outcome funds are awarded to the district rather than to the schools where the outcomes occur, weakening the connection between action and reward at the school level. Second, outcomes funding benchmarks are not aligned with the measures used in Tennessee's federal and state accountability systems, weakening the signal of outcomes funding and creating the risk of potential incoherence. We hope the TISA Review Committee will consider adjustments to improve the coherence of outcomes funding. And then their third point is to improve the data transparency to better connect TISA funding to a local decision-making and student outcomes. TISA is a more transparent model than the BEP it replaced, but accessing information on how funds are allocated and used remains challenging. Financial reporting is dispersed across multiple TDOE web pages, and reports make it challenging to understand how funding translates into school-level action and student outcomes. Additionally, 2 key processes for strengthening the implementation of TISA, the Progress Review Board and the Outcomes Committee, are not visible to the public. We think streamlining reporting and increasing visibility into key processes would be a good use of the TISA Review Committee's efforts to better connect funding decisions to the outcome for students. And we will be sure that each one of the committee members get these 3 points from SCORE. But those are 3 factors that they brought up. And like I say, what we'd like to do is to open this up for discussion of what are things that you would like for this committee to consider. So if there's someone who would like to speak, raise your hand. Yes, let's see, Eddie Pruitt, Mr. Pruitt.
Thank you, Bob. I want to just echo what everybody's been talking about. I think from a district's perspective, being a superintendent, the biggest issue that I hear all of my superintendent friends talk about is the issue with economically disadvantaged. I mean, we have districts that are potentially going to be they're already at a cliff if that hold harmless is not there. So something has to be done there. That's first and foremost. I also think we need to consider, and I don't know how to do it, but I just want to put it out there for the group, the amount of, the need that we have for behaviorists, behavior interventionists, support for our teachers. I don't know that was figured into the TISA equation, back when it was brought up. I think that might need to be something to be considered to be added to the formula.
I think that's a very good point, Eddie. In fact, it brings up a question that I had for people to be thinking about. If you recall back in the BEP days, we made recommendations. I know one recommendation was for additional nurses. Another recommendation was for more guidance counselors. So as you're talking about behavioralists. So a question I would have here is, under TISA, what is more challenging that you face these districts, and look specifically talking the district, that you're facing about because of TISA? And also maybe what has gotten better? Have the nursing ratios or the counselor ratios gotten better? Or so think about the districts, think about your funding under TISA and how you execute, and what are the challenges that you're facing that we might recommend, or what are the things that are improving that we could highlight, think about.
Mr. Eby, I'm on the phone, so I'm not able to raise my hand. May I share a thought, or is there someone else in line?
Go ahead, Bob, and then Marlon Davis will be next.
Thank you for the opportunity. Once again, superb presentation today. I strongly agree with Superintendent Pruitt that probably the number one thing that needs to be thought through is economic disadvantage, because I mean, year after year of hold harmless, I mean, it's obviously not a solution. And so I think we've had really fascinating presentations today to help us think about what's the best alternative. I mean, obviously nothing will be more sort of precise than individual level determination. And I think some kind of supplementary individuals form, maybe for families, you don't have to have everyone do it. It could be for those families who maybe don't get met through, you know, the direct search. So maybe there's 5, 10, 15% of people that we could pick up more accurately through that way, and we could think around the incentives. The flip side is, I mean, that is kind of laborious, and I imagine a lot of people wouldn't want to go back to it. And so I think using one of the other proxies, you know, the Medicaid, for instance, and then just adjusting the weight, because if that's going to swing the pendulum too far, then you can still hit a financial target by adjusting the weight. I think that probably is the number one thing that has to be looked at. But in the spirit of opening the conversation a little bit, I'd like to just put one other potential priority in front of the committee, and I hope that in future meetings we could dig into some of these data as well. And this is something that I think is actually a huge positive of TISA, but that needs further work. I think the unique learning needs structure is a profound improvement. My school, I serve the largest percentage of students with disabilities of any charter in the state, and I'm friendly with a number of the other charters that have high students with disabilities populations. And we saw, Mr. Chairman, like a 20% recurring funding increase, because under the old system, you got the same amount of funding whether the child was typically abled or had cerebral palsy, which is of course insane. And so TISA has dramatically improved our ability to provide sustainable continuum of services and placements for a range of students with disabilities. But when we were on the TISA committee several years ago, when it was first being formulated, looking at examples from around the country, the highest tier of needs, so we're talking about children who under TISA would be considered like ULN 7, 8, 9, 10. In our state model, those students are only being funded at 125, 150% of the base, which again is a huge improvement. But there's other states where those students were being funded at 250 or 300% of the base. And we're talking about students whom serving them individually may cost 25 or 30,000 or more, right? We're talking about a small number of children with the most severe needs. And in order for them to have quality options, I really do think that the percentage weight on the top 4 highest ULN buckets needs to be looked at. And a lot of people would probably agree with that. I'll say something that might be less popular, which is that if the total dollars can't be revisited by the state, I would go so far as to say we should look at actually reducing the funding weight for the lowest tiers, tiers 1 and 2, of which there are many, many children who receive a small amount of additional funding. I would do an incremental reduction in that to redistribute some dollars to the smaller number of most severe need students, if that were the only way to do it. And I think there's precedent in other states for that. So I'll stop there, but that's my second most significant, I think, concern. And just to briefly append to that, I think it would be very interesting to talk about extending this exclusively for pre-K students with disabilities. The ULN factor only. There's been many articles in the paper over the last year about districts, because of our early intervention law in Tennessee, which is very good. It's good that we're identifying children before they start full-time school, but it's essentially an unfunded mandate for districts to now provide clinical and even educational services for 3 or 4-year-old children with disabilities who may not be served through the state's small VPK program. So I think that's 2B, right? Item 2 is look at the ULN weights, and point 2B under that is consider that even for states that the student is requiring, students that the state is requiring us to serve through TEIS. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go with Marlon Davis and then Gary Lilly. And then I'm going to ask Mr. James to kind of explain our process, because I think I got a little bit confused here with regard to how we'll put together our survey. So go ahead, Mr. Davis. I think you're muted.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Chairman. I want to echo too what Eddie Pruitt said there. And I know probably most of us in looking at the presentation that we heard and the data, and thank you to all of your presenters. And I've got some good data and some things that I wrote down while listening to you. And I appreciate that information. It helps me to understand it a little bit better. I didn't know that the definition actually took some legislative action in 2016 in order to create this. I didn't know where it came about, so I learned a good bit today. I do know that by adding that definition, I heard that we would include 157,500 more students to it. You know, as in my experience as being as a teacher, coach, a principal, a supervisor at a district, director of schools, and 35 years in working with school districts, especially at the principal level. If a kid was on Medicaid, they were economically disadvantaged. Throw out definitions. I mean, you can just say that, you know, they came from families that had needs, and those kids needed additional services. A lot of times they were, you know, maybe behind in reading levels, things like that. And as a principal, I had to balance and schedule, how can I use the funds that the district provides for me to maybe provide additional aides in that classroom, or get another certified teacher, or, you know, how can we do that to provide the services that they need? So, you know, I think we need to go back, and I believe a lot of you in what you heard is we need to look back at that definition. If it takes legislative action to change the definition for economically disadvantaged, that is a priority. And Bob, you brought up an interesting statement earlier in our talk, and your question was it just too expensive? You know, that the state didn't consider this, and that, you know, I know it wasn't a budget priority at the time, but, you know, could we reduce the weight, add more students in Medicaid, and add these students, then reduce the weight allocation and things such as that? It's not too expensive. We can put $155 million to serve 15,000 additional kids in the voucher program. We can put $155 million into adequately serving 157,500 students, which is a huge number, and get districts funds that they need to provide the services that are required to serve those students. So there's no doubt to me in hearing the presentation that this is a priority. A couple other things that I've heard from districts, you know, as I travel around and visit with directors, is one of those, and Eddie brought it up, it's behavior and interventionists, additional funding for those types of positions. Another one is a salary component, where you know, districts are trying to keep up with those that were already above 50,000 and they received their TISA allocation. The TISA allocation says there's a component that has to be spent on salary. That amount did not equal what it required districts to cover within their salary schedule. And the reason being is we have different levels. The salary schedule looks different when the state adopted salary schedule is. I know the governor passed legislation is very well needed, that we need to get to 50,000 for beginning level teachers by 27, and districts have worked to do that. And but the funds that were put in TISA were not enough to cover how our salary schedules were set up. Okay, they weren't identical to the state, and I hope that they understand that their additional funds were needed in meeting what each district needed to meet the salary mandate. Okay. And another thing is a smaller schools. It seems like the smaller the school system, we have 23 school districts that are, I think it's 23, fewer than 1,000 in ADM. And then we have 14 school districts, I believe, that fit between the range of 1,000 ADM and 1,500 ADM. So there's 37 districts that fall within that 1,500 and fewer students within their district. Seem like they're struggling more meeting their costs under the TISA formula than they were under the BEP. And I don't know what has caused that, all the components of it to it. Some of it's some, you know, local things that have applied to it. But I think we need to relook at, and we had a bill out this year that looked at adding percentage increase to those districts that were identified as small schools, changing that definition in the TISA formula, and then putting a small increase in for those districts that were 1,000, 1,500. So, I feel like those are some priorities we may consider, because I visited about 80 school districts and talked to directors the last couple of years, and those are 3 of the points that I've picked up from discussions with them. So I'll stop there and leave it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Gary Lilly.
Hi, good afternoon. I think I'm super happy we're having this discussion about the economically disadvantaged formula. I think it's super important. If we're looking at priorities, things that I hear from district leaders, in addition to what Eddie was talking about as far as supports for behavioral and counseling, what have you. Also here to kind of touch on something Bob mentioned, need adequate and recurring funding for pre-K and preschool, whether that's special education preschool or even the BPK program for the funding to keep up with the expenses. And also I often hear about the need for infrastructure funding. Thank you.
Points. Thank you, Gary. Yes, Mr. Davis again. Or have you removed your hand's still waved? Okay. I think you just need to remove it. Good comments. Mr. James, you want to explain the process while other people may be thinking?
Yes, sir. Happy to. And it's a good thing to have some folks on, Marlon and a couple of our superintendents who also joined us so long on the BEP review committee. Eddie Pruitt, Michelle Simcox, has got some experience going through this process. And so what we've done in the past, and we found to be kind of the best approach, and what turned the BEP review committee from asking for $750 million after the executive budget was already put together and constantly getting a no, to breaking down priorities into chunks, a lot of which, by the way, are in this TISA formula now because of the work of your predecessors. The way that we figured out to make that happen was to do a priority survey. So what we would do is send a survey out in between now and July, and you would list your priorities in order: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we get all the responses in. Now, keep in mind, for those of you that are designees, only the principals, the folks who were appointed to this committee, can respond to those surveys. So that'd be some conversations that needed to have, and that is a matter of law that allows you to serve as a proxy, but does not allow you to vote. Okay, and so we get in the surveys, and the survey response is all electronic. It's something that we can make that we make public, but whatever appears on the list the most, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, becomes priority 1. Whatever is second most, 2, third most, 3, fourth most, 4, and then so on. It makes sure that the principals, the members who are appointed, get their say on it. And the processing is incredibly transparent because you can see at the end what the numbers are in terms of the priorities. Then what we do is we ask Marianne and our friends over at the Office of Local Finance to run the numbers, come back and put a price tag on it. Now, why is that important? Because the TISA Review Committee, just like the BEP Review Committee, it exists for a couple of reasons. One, to figure out structural changes that may need to happen within the TISA formula, but also as a pressure release valve. At the State Board of Education, we've got an interesting requirement in law that tells us to offer advice to the General Assembly and to the governor for the expenditure of public dollars. Yet we have a constitution, of course, that makes it very clear that that's the legislature's responsibility. So it's through this committee that the public education world is able to make some priorities known. And in that way, we take priority one, say whatever it is, and then over to the side of it, TDOE has a number. This is what it would cost to implement. 2, 3, 4, and 5. So what we'll do after this discussion, and I say that to make sure that everybody's getting out on the table what they want to get out on the table so that other folks can be thinking about it. Between now and the next meeting, you will get this survey, and you need to fill those out. Again, just the principles. Now, we've also been charged under the law with identifying solutions on economically disadvantaged. So if you wanted to include in your 1 through 5 something on economically disadvantaged, you could do that. Or the third of our 4 meetings that we have through the year, we could also come to a conclusion on that. So I think probably the easiest way would be to do TISA priorities, where if some of those solutions come up as one of the top 5 issues of the committee, then it gets included there. And if the committee doesn't feel like we've gotten into that enough, then we'll take it up at our 3rd meeting. It generally this way saves a lot of debate while making certain that every single person who's appointed to the committee has the chance to weigh in. It was through that process that we got the 11th and 12th month of insurance. It's how we got a lot of the changes that happened with BEP. So then with those top 5 priorities, Chairman Eby writes a letter. That letter goes to the Commissioner of Finance and Administration and the Commissioner of Education. And that would happen in the July to August timeframe. Why? Because as Marlon can tell you, when we just relied on the BEP Review Committee report, that would come out the 1st of November. Well, the executive branch is well down the interstate on what the executive budget is going to look like by that point in time. And so consistently, we would put those things together. Consistently, they wouldn't make a difference. So we undertake this process to inform the process of putting together the executive budget a little bit better. So I'm happy to take questions about that and to answer any concerns. And
Nathan,
sir,
I just want to clarify because I'm probably a little bit confused. Maybe nobody else is, but make sure I understand. So today we're talking about priorities or concerns, issues that each one of the people on this call think is important to be considered.
Yes, sir.
Then we're going to send out a survey, and we're going to ask for the official voting members to prioritize, say, their top 5 or so. And they may be things that we've considered today,
right,
or they may be things that they've thought about since then.
Right.
If my concern is there may be something out there that we haven't raised today that is very important, that would make the top 5, that the other participants might not think about. And so what's the process if people come up with ideas between now and the time that we turn in the survey for the voting members to also be thinking about and consider, to assure that the 5 list that we get is the best list we can have, point 1. And then point two, what I've heard today are variations on those five, whether, you increase the definition of economically disadvantaged with or without expanding the eligibility to, preschool, or changing the weighting factors. And so therefore you get more students in there and the weighting factor goes down. I think you said that under that circumstance, that might be a discussion for our next board meeting to kind of hone that down. Is that correct? And if that's correct, okay.
So the situation is that we have two requirements in law that we didn't have prior to the passage of this act that we devoted the first half of this meeting to, right? So prior to that, what the TISA Review Committee was charged with in law is coming up with changes that folks would like to see, issues that they'd like to see addressed in TISA generally. Now, separately, we have this issue of economically disadvantaged, which we're charged to make recommendations on under a separate portion of the law. And so that puts a couple of those requirements, perhaps to be dealt with differently. And I guess the question would be, what would you prefer? You could do all in one, but since there is this special statute, I thought it'd probably be good to have the discussion and to come up with potential solutions on the economically disadvantaged separately.
Okay,
So in other words,
you're
you don't
saying
want one to
that's
supplant the other.
so what we're saying is the priority of five that we're talking about would be everything else except for economically disadvantaged. And we would deal with economic, because it sounds like to me there's a general consensus that something needs to be changed, maybe, what I'm hearing, although people may disagree, but at least we need to consider it, whether we change it or not. But you're saying that would be considered separately in the group of five of the other priority items that we recommend that the government look into are a complete different set of five issues. Is that what you're saying?
I would say that might be the easiest way to go about it, because the other thing is a number of these changes would require a statutory change. All right. So whereas historically, when you're talking about five priorities, you're talking about five priorities in the budgetary process, right? So yes, it's a matter of law in that if they make it into the executive budget and they're passed by the legislature, then yes, that as the budgetary policy is a matter of law. But on this other matter, which we have a separate statute, the first half of the meeting we spent on, it sounds to me, and anybody please tell me if I'm wrong or if you're seeing it a different way, but it sounds to me like that would probably, most of those solutions, at least that we've discussed, would probably require separate legislation. Maybe it wouldn't, but typically in the past it's been five on budget.
Gotcha. Does this process make sense to people? Is it understandable doing it this way? And if so, then the issue I have on the five is that if you have other items other than the few that we've talked about today, besides the economically disadvantaged, bring them up now, or let's pass them around and be sure, that we get them out to the people so that when we do the survey in July, we'll have a full deck to play with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, maybe if not to further complicate matters, but if Mr. James could basically do kind of a pre-survey, essentially what we're doing now, if you give us a 2-week window or whatever to submit, then he can finalize that list for people to vote upon. My clarifying question would be, are you wanting us to keep these priorities kind of high level and thematic, or do you want them very narrow and specific, right? Because if they're narrow and specific, that's going to proliferate the number, right? Because there's probably 4 or 5 proposals that could be discussed with respect to solving the ED, right? You know, versus is sort of that's the number 1 of 5 or the number 1 of, you know, 1 plus 5, right? First, the same thing with the ULN that I brought up, just for example. I mean, is that, I would think that's sort of 2 proposals, one around pre-K ULN specifically, one around the distribution of ULN weights more generally. So I don't know
Bob,
if you want to give guidance.
Let me respond just from the experience that we've had in the past, and obviously it's been a few years. If we get too specific, it can be difficult, because what I totally understand what you're talking about. If you're saying that priority 1 is a complex program that has categories A through Z in it, then that's going to be, obviously that's not going to show up more than once. If, however, you say a priority is increasing, for example, the number of nurses to the national best average, or the number of behavioral specialists to the national best practice, right? Each of those things are general. So if we got 15 survey responses and they were coming at that from a similar angle, you could put them together in one to address that issue without necessarily answering everything, like you're offering a bill or a specific amendment to the budget. In other words, it would have to go to the folks at F&A, and the folks at F&A, along with the Department of Education, those folks that work on the creation of the executive budget, take the recommendation of the committee and figure out how that can work. That's how we had the best success before. It doesn't mean you can't get specific. It just means that this is not a process of us prescribing. That ultimately, this will be work that's done by folks at the Department of Education and Finance and Administration. And ultimately, the governor would have to say, yes, I want to include that in my executive budget. And then the legislature has to say, not only is it included in the executive budget, but we're going to pass it. So it's the difference between kind of prescribing an entire course to get there versus raising the issue and saying we'd like to get farther down the road.
Dr. Morrison.
Thank you. And thank you to all our presenters. I did find this very informative and thought-provoking today. Putting a finer point on that and maybe raising a question, Nathan, as you said, this is the first time this committee has met under the TISA formula, which is a different fundamentally formula than BEP in terms of input versus student-based. So things like that we did in the past around recommending nurses is your example. I'm wondering, even the example about behavioral specialists, how should we think about that as a committee when TISA is really based on sort of more student inputs? I mean, we're looking at the economically disadvantaged definition, thinking about outcomes pieces. There's parts that are specific to TISA that were not true with BEP. And I'm just trying to think as a committee how we can be most strategic in the way that we recommend in our report for improvements in TISA versus how we might have done it for BEP. Does that make sense? Like, are there additional parameters that we should consider as we put this list together?
And I think Bob Nardo's suggestion of doing a preliminary, I think what he's suggesting is a survey that creates a menu, and from that menu people could choose. But we would also have to leave it open, if someone wants to share something else as well.
So let me try this. Why don't we ask people, and I think Dr. Morrison has a good comment, is that, this is not BEP, it is TISA. So we ought to, and, the funding formula from that standpoint, think about that. Think about, again, the purpose of this committee is to recommend, improvements to the funding formula to affect improved learning for our students. So let me ask each person to go back and in the next 2 weeks, or Nathan, you can set a time period or something like that.
Sure.
To come up with your list of items that you think would be appropriate for an improvement for the TISA funding formula, that then we could send out as part of our survey. Again, I think the definition of economically disadvantaged, I agree, is a separate issue. So it's those issues specifically associated with TISA. But then we could send out and determine, is there a top 5 priority? Each person will vote on what their survey, what they think are the top priorities, and then we will summarize that and bring that back to the committee at the next meeting. Does that make sense, Nathan?
Yeah, we could do that. I think we have to recognize that there's we have 2 more statutorily required meetings. And so, if we decided to use meeting number 3, for example, to go after that, then we could do that in July or August. And then we would just have, we could do our 4th meeting, last week in October, when we all go through and approve the final report, kind of line by line.
But I think you said that it's important that we get some kind of priority list to F&A in the August time period. Isn't that what you said?
Yes, sir. Yeah, because you've got, as soon as the year closes out, July 1, the F&A is kind of working to get everything closed from the previous year. And then about middle of the month, that's when the first meetings start to happen. We've got folks, we've got Greg Turner on, and he knows better than anybody about what the time frame ought to be. And so by all means, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that July, early August timeframe is when it could probably have the most impact.
Well, I think this committee has a real opportunity. I think we showed it in the BEP. We did do some things that made some differences, and under the TISA, I think we have the opportunity to do that. And I think we ought to take the full opportunity that we have and meet the schedule. So, Greg Turner, any comments on input timelines from you or your own?
No, I think Nathan pretty much hit it. We typically have budget requests in from agencies by October 1st. So I think that, having that same timeline with your recommendations would be beneficial for everyone.
Okay. Troy Kilzer has his hand up.
I'm sorry, was that?
You're muted. Troy Kilzer is mute. He's trying to speak, but he's muted.
I've been muted the whole time. I forgot. Sorry about that. Thanks, Mr. Bob. And just following up with what you had shared about, the TISA model is supposed to being more intentional about raising the bar as far as our students' performance. One thing that I've been dealing with locally in our own community, which would be the impact that would come on our local community if we were looking about raising the base or raising the weights for whatever reason. My local community has already made a commitment to reduce our property tax value, still meeting the maintenance of effort through sales tax, but it's been a very contentious conversation this late spring, early summer to get our budget passed. One thing that I have already attempted to do, but probably to a failing, is to educate our staff and our local superintendents about the direct and the outcome allocation portions, which are solely state funded. I'm not necessarily, I'm not disagreeing at all with what Eddie Pruitt had said earlier, because we have those issues, behavioral issues, even as low as preschool age kids, just really difficult situations for our staff to have to process and deal with. and additional funds for that purpose would benefit. But I know that my local community probably would be the war cry to support it until they realize that they have a portion to pay. So my effort would be to consider how can we better educate our entire district communities about the direct and the outcomes allocation as they're written right now. I would suspect that there is very little, I know from my district, very little strategic planning with the district or with our direct and outcomes allocation portions, which are governed or guided to higher student performance. So that's just my 2 cents.
Good comments, good points. I mean, our objective is for results, and the outcome rewards good results. Any other comments? So, does anybody object to the fact that what we will do is ask within the next couple of weeks that you look at this from your TISA funding models and put in your recommendations on how we can improve, what we can recommend to improve the results of our students. From that, we will take that list. See, we're into, so it'll put us into mid-June. And Nathan, how quickly could we get that out to the people to do their surveys? And then if they can get their surveys back within 2 weeks, then we can compile everything and have it by mid-July.
I think we can get a basic survey out by Monday. I would say for you all that are designees, this is going to go to the email addresses that we have for the principals, right? So just making sure that they know it's coming, and that's something they could, I feel like we could get that out. Tail end of this week, which we are already in, to early next week, and get it in front of folks. And then the other thing to remember is that this is what you're creating, what they're creating with their responses is a public record. So it is just like we discussed last time, you can't pick up the phone and call each other and talk about what you want to say. Because this is created by statute. It's advising a policy-making board or body, and it also will end up advising the General Assembly. So it has to be, siloed in that way.
So Nathan, again, to address the issue, because we can't talk between now and then, people will send in their survey of 5, and somebody may think of something that this committee today hasn't thought of. We will have that list. We will compile that list with sort of the top 5, but we will send back out to everybody all the response, a summary of all the responses. And then will we get back together and gather general consensus that this is the list, this is the 5 we're going to go in with, in case somebody then sees at that point, oh, I didn't see what Gary Lilly put in. I thought that was a great idea, and
yeah, I misunderstood, Bob. I thought you were talking about a preliminary survey and then having all
right. So the survey you're talking about is the preliminary survey. I wanted to be sure that,
and then the results of that would go out with the next survey.
Perfect.
People could kind of pick their top 5
Perfect.
from that.
Perfect.
Does that work?
Yep, that works for me.
Okay.
Does anybody have any objections to that process or recommendations for an improvement to that process? If not, then we'll send it out next week. Thank you, Nathan. I think that pretty well addresses the next steps. You got any final comments from your side, Nathan?
Hey, I appreciate it. You know, the chairman and I were talking about it earlier today, and it's a learning process for everybody, right? You know, we have kind of basic railroad tracks that we've been down before, but it's also so important that each of you have been willing to bring out what's really going on, especially y'all in districts. There's no other way to know except for what you're doing here. So just a big thank you and thanks for putting up with me.
Yeah, I'll say my thanks too. It's interesting. This has been a year in education. I see our Vice Gerald Collins is on the call, and he chaired our accountability hearings that we had a month ago. First time in the nation that those were done, and I thought, you know, we learned a lot from that. I think we made a lot of good progress. I think there'll be a lot of good that come out of it. Exactly. I think the same thing here. This is the first time that we've done this from a TISA standpoint. We're continuing to learn. As long as we all put our focus on what's best for the students, we'll make progress. And thank you for your time, and look forward to your survey answers. Nothing else, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, the only thing I would like to quickly say at the end, and I'm sure everyone's eager to go, is given that a couple of good ideas over the last year or two have been set aside by the legislature on the basis of the size of the fiscal note, I really hope that we can work together to focus on getting some, let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good, right? And if we can formulate some ideas that are more modest, that we might not get everything we want, but it would be a good step and it would be easier for the General Assembly to absorb, that would be better. So when the ideas go for the fiscal note, let's maybe not overshoot on them, right? But make them more incremental. That's just a thought.
Good point. Good point, Bob. Okay, thanks. Have a great day. See you.